Okay, well, thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Dan Olson. I'm the superintendent for the Monona Grove School District. We are live streaming this evening, so with those of you that are watching at home not able to be with us, there'll be opportunities as well for to provide information and for you to ask questions as well that you might have. So with that, we're going to begin with a short presentation, and then we'll finish up opportunity to have questions and answer and some dialogue. Okay, so again, for those that might be watching on the live stream, at the presentation we'll have the questions. You can email questions at mgreferendum@mgschools.net. There's also FAQs on our website. All this information and background information I'm going to go through this evening is also on our website. Okay, so there are four things that we're going to talk about tonight. First of all, we're going to talk about school funding in Wisconsin and specifically how it impacts us here in Monona Grove. Secondly, we'll talk about the cost of this proposed phase-in operational referendum. We'll then talk about the consequences of inaction. And then lastly, again, the information, additional FAQs and other information. Okay, so let's start by talking about school funding. First question, why now? Why does the Monona Grove School District believe that now is the time to go to an operational referendum? And there's really three key reasons. Number one is the rapidly increasing cost to maintain our current operations. Secondly, the expiration of federal COVID relief funds that will end after this year. And then third, our stagnant state funding. All right, so let's start by talking about the state funding. That is really what drives our budget as well as all school district budgets in Wisconsin. About 42% of our revenue is from state funding. And so any adjustments at that point made at the state level have a dramatic impact on our operations and budget. And so what we're looking at in just trying to really maintain our existing programming, with those operational costs. So the last 2 years, there was no increase in the state in our per pupil funding. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about why, they may have chosen to do that, but that's really what's caused the issue that we have. Our per pupil revenue was at zero these last 2 years. And so if you look at overall state funding, and this graph shows a little bit historically, starting back in 2002, Wisconsin was ranked 11th in the national average on per pupil funding, and then by 2020 had fallen to an average of about 25th. There's actually been some studies that indicate that now in 2022 we might be as low as 30th. And so you'll see the up and down, and that really back in about 2015 is where we really hit that national average, and it's continued to decline since that time. All right, this graph gives another picture of looking at our state funding as you compare it to inflation over time. So this goes back to, again, 2008, and at that time, the bottom line shows the actual per pupil funding in Wisconsin compared to inflation. And so you might recall in 2010-2011 budget is when the state had the budget repair bill, also known as Act 10, and where there was a significant decrease in school funding. And then over time, it's been slight increases up to these last 2 years. Again, it's been flat with no increase. And so that gap between what school funding has been compared to inflation amounts to a little bit over $3,000 per pupil. Now, again, that's the state average, not specifically, those aren't the actual numbers here in Monona Grove. Okay, so we talked about federal funds. And so all school districts throughout the nation received federal funds these last 3 years as COVID relief funds. And those funds were intended to help school districts recover from the pandemic, to have additional supplementary funding for additional programming and supports for students. We know what the impact has been on students during that time, particularly when schools were closed or not being able to be fully open. And so with that, as the state approved their last 2-year budget, that was given as the rationale as to why they did not increase the state per pupil funding, because some legislators felt that the federal funding was enough for school districts to make it over these last 2 years. There's a couple issues with that made it particularly difficult for here in Monona Grove. Number one, for all school districts, that was one-time funding. And so the problem is, you got that one-time funding that goes away after this year, then that creates a fiscal cliff. So our per pupil actually then drops, after these last 2 years. The other thing is, those federal funds were not distributed the same way in all school districts. Federal funds, part of the formula was based, one of the key parts of the formula was based on your poverty in your school district. Monona Grove is generally a low poverty district. Therefore, the amount of funds that we received per pupil compared to many other school districts was far less. So the amount of federal funds we received was not enough for us to just maintain current programmings to make up for that no increase, from the state. And then the third piece of that, of course, is our cost increase. We all know that inflation has been high these last couple of years, and so school districts, like everyone else, have costs that we can't control that continue to increase. Our operations costs, when we talk about things like utilities, transportation, those continue to increase. And then our staffing is a big piece as well. Trying to keep up with at least cost of living increases for our staff is very difficult to do, but that's a minimum that we would like in order to continue the operations. And so again, back to that graph showing that gap between actual funding and the inflationary costs. Okay, so is Monona Grove alone in this challenge? And the answer is absolutely not. This has impacted all schools in Wisconsin. And in fact, in the last 5 years, 79 school districts have passed recurring referenda for many of the same reasons that I just pointed out. And this most recently, here in Dane County, 7 out of the 16 districts just passed a referendum last fall because of this financial situation. So as I mentioned, staffing is about 70% of our budget, as well as then those other increasing costs is what really creates our challenges. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about staffing. Okay, that's what school districts do. We hire quality teachers, support staff, people that maintain and operate our buildings, and that's the bulk of our budget. And so the other challenge that we have right now, of course, is the labor shortage that everyone is experiencing, and it's no different in school districts. Teaching positions, support positions, all positions have been very difficult to fill. It's very competitive, and so maintaining competitive wages and compensation is really important as well. And the other thing that's kind of hit at the same time, particularly in teaching, is statewide we've seen a trend of a large number of teacher retirements at this time, which has created an additional challenge. And so really our challenge is trying to be competitive with our Dane County peers in attracting and retaining quality staff. Okay, so really you put that all together to create this issue: increased costs, one-time federal funds going away, stagnant state funding. That's created this structural deficit that we're dealing with that we're going to talk about here shortly. Okay, so what would this referendum do for our school district? Okay, this is simply to preserve and maintain the status quo. The dollar amounts that are being asked for are not to increase programming, to increase staffing, is to maintain what we currently have. Secondly, it would then provide stability moving forward. So when we make commitments to that staffing and the other things that the budget, as we make commitments to a stable budget, that this referendum would provide that stability. And then it really serves as kind of a reset. We really look at our funding every year is on a per pupil basis. And so this referendum would give the district a kind of a reset of that per pupil amount to work forward, moving on. All right, so of course, real important piece is what is this going to cost the taxpayer? Okay, so the first question might be, well, what have we done to try to limit costs before we go to the taxpayers and ask for additional funding? So one of the biggest things that we've looked at and to make savings over the past several years is our health insurance plan. We know that benefits are a really important part of our compensation, but we also know that health insurance benefits can be very costly. And so there have been a number of plan design changes over the last several years, and particularly over the last 2 years, that have resulted in significant savings for the district. Our utilities, we've worked really hard on trying to have energy efficiency programs put in place. For example, we just added solar panels to the high school that will significantly reduce the energy cost for that building over time. And then we also do keep a fund balance. Fund balance is really important as we receive our state aid oftentimes well after the school year starts. And so to have a fund balance to be able to meet payroll and without having to do significant short-term borrowing is important. But we have used a portion of that fund balance to help us get through this current budget year. And then enrollment growth. I think we all know that we are seeing growth, particularly in the village of Cottage Grove, and that is bringing new students. We've had 37 new students enroll since the start of the school year alone. The way the funding formula works is that if we have student growth, eventually that certainly helps us, and we do get that per pupil increase. The challenge is that the formula looks at the 3-year average of your enrollment. And so as enrollment increases, it really takes 3 years to get that full funding for each of those students. Okay, so this graph shows the kind of the phase-in approach. So again, school districts have been under revenue limits since 1993. And so what the operating referendums do is the taxpayers authorize the school board to exceed those revenue limits by whatever the dollar amount is on those referendums. So the current operating referendum that we're under in 21-22 and 22-23 is to exceed the revenue limits by 3.7 million. So that's what we've had from the previous referendum. The referendum that's being proposed then to make up for that freeze these last 2 years, asks for 6 million for the first year, and then to phase in the next year to maintain, again, those same costs, 1.6 million, the next year 2.5. Those numbers are basically to take into account for inflationary costs each of those next 2 years. And then at that point, okay, it does not keep going up. That's the cap, and then that is the revenue limit amount moving forward. Okay, so how does that impact the tax bill? Okay, so there's a couple ways of looking at it. This chart shows the actual tax impact per $1,000 of fair market value on a home. Now, again, these are averages. Everyone's assessed value, is a little bit different in how that impacts your actual tax bill, but the rate on average would be $2.05 per $1,000 in that first year. In year 2, 52 cents, and then in the third year, 77 cents. And that would coincide with the larger numbers where the first year is 6 million, then 1.6, and 2.25. Okay, another way of looking at the tax impact. This is the mill rate. This is the rate that is determined as we look at what the total tax levy is from the school district that's sent to the municipalities. And this shows the mill rate history over time, actually over the last 30 years. So it goes back to 1993, as I mentioned, when revenue limits were first in place. You can see the mill rate was over $20 at that point. And so clearly at that point, school districts around Wisconsin relied very heavily on local property taxes and not so much on state revenue. And so at that time, the state increased funding significantly for schools. They made a commitment to pay for 2/3 of funding, but in place then put revenue limits. And so you see the mill rate drop dramatically those next few years. And then over the next 10, 15, 20 years, it's some decreases and leveled out and to where we really have been over these last 10 years. And so you see at this point is 2016. Our initial operating referendum in 2016 showed a slight bump up, as you would expect, and then it decreased from there. There was another referendum then in 1920 for a slight bump up, and you see it steadily decrease those next 4 years. And so This is where we're at right now. The proposed referendum would bump that mill rate back up to those levels at where we're at back, even below where we're at in 1819. So that, in looking at the big picture, is the overall impact. Now the real story is, well, what does it mean for my personal property taxes? What's my tax bill going to look like? Okay, so now again, this is an average. Of course, it changes depending on municipality and how assessed values vary and so on. But this shows the last 5 years. So this is the school portion of your property tax bill. As you know, you have the overall property tax, there's the school portion, there's the village or city portion, the town, perhaps if you live in the town, county has a piece in there, the technical college. The school portion back in 2021 was just under $4,000, about $3,800 on the school portion for a $300,000 home. And then these last 2 years, there's been significant decreases. So on average, in our school district, the average homeowner has seen about a 17% decrease on the school portion of their property tax. Okay, maybe not overall, but on the school portion. And that's as a result of, again, of, decreased levy because of decreased, or no increase in revenue limit. The projection, if this referendum passes, then on the average property tax is by the third year at its maximum to take that, again, close to that $3,800 range, actually slightly lower than where it was in 2021. So really the overall tax bill is really looking to kind of make up what's happened these last 2 years where there's decline and take it back at those pre-levels. So again, everyone's property tax is a little bit different depending on the value of the home, but on average in the district, that was what it should look like. Okay, of course, there's a number of assumptions, right, on what happens with equalized value and so on, and what might happen with additional state support in the future. So these are the budget assumptions that we made to come up with those figures. Okay, so in the next biennium budget, we are predicting that we will get an increase from the state of $200 per pupil in year 1 and $400 per pupil in year 2. The governor has actually proposed more than it in his budget. We're pretty clear that by the time we get through joint finance, the dollar amount will be far less than that. So that's a pretty conservative estimate of what we think we might get in state support. So that's one of the assumptions that we made moving forward. All right, and then lastly, okay, what is the impact if it does fail? Okay, so the first thing that would happen, we would engage our stakeholders, our people that are affected, our teachers and our parents and our staff. We would have about $6 million that we'd have to make up for the next year. That's our projected deficit going into the next year's budget. To put in that perspective, our overall budget right now is a little bit over $50 million. I think about 54 this past year, 55 million. Oh, 50, okay. So we're about 50 million in our overall budget. So 6 million is a pretty significant amount. So if you look at, having 70% of your budget going towards staffing, you can try to cut back as much as you can in those operation costs and so on, but there's really not much to go. So it means basically reducing in staffing or compensation. At the end of the day, it means increased class sizes and less support positions, for students. All right, we've had previous operational referendums. Why didn't that solve our funding problems? Well, the previous ones that were approved were non-recurring. They were for a set period of time. The reason the school board chose to ask for non-recurring at that time was because of the uncertainty of the state budget. They thought it prudent that if we ask for a 4-year period, we'll see where the state is at that time and make it determine what the needs are moving forward. Well, after 2 cycles of non-recurring, we've seen that the state support has not increased, in fact, it's decreased. And that's why the board chose this time to ask for recurring to do that reset. Otherwise, the chance to come back again, you're just at that new starting point. So it really, by doing the recurring, provides that stability, moving forward. Okay, so again, those of you that might be viewing this video, there's plenty of opportunity for additional opportunities to have conversation beyond this evening. We have 2 virtual question and answer sessions coming up on March 15th and 21st. In addition to tonight, we have another in-person session on March 7th at Winnequa School. And again, all these links and information is on our website. And again, when we're remind everyone that we encourage everyone to vote and be an informed voter on April 4th. And again, as I mentioned, the website, the emails that people can respond to, that you can email specific questions about the referendum. There's also a link on there if you have specific questions for our school board members or myself, Mark Powell, our business manager, or Katie Burns-Kaiser, our communications director. Any of us would be glad to take any questions. Okay, so with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions or comments with the people that are here this evening. Because we are recording it, we are going to ask that you use the microphone so that we can hear your questions.
Dan, is the bottom line here that the taxes in the 3rd year will be 13 million more than they are today? Your revenues will be 13 million?
The tax levy, well, okay, I want to make sure I answer this correctly. So there's a couple different ways of looking at it. The actual tax levy would be, we're at 3.7 over right now, so it's actually be about 13.1 over where we're at today.
That's my question.
Yeah, yes.
So, and that would be ongoing. 13 million is going to be is going to happen every year after the 3rd year.
Yeah, and I want to make sure I get this. First of all, the answer to that is yes. That's the new base moving forward. Mark, I'll make sure I answer it. It's not necessarily the levy; it's the revenue limit that is that much. So that'd be a combination of levy and state aid, or is it the levy itself that we're talking about? Make sure I answer that correctly. Okay. So the revenue limit authority, okay, it could be a combination of levy and aid, or is that just the levy that we're talking about?
No, the revenue limit is.
Yeah.
I should use this.
Yeah.
The revenue limit calculation is a combination of a lot of different factors, but the 2 main ones are the state aid and the levy.
Yeah.
So if we get more aid, the amount of the levy would go down. Overall levy. The 13 whatever is part of the calculation every year, but the impact would be less if we got more state aid.
Yeah. So the revenue would be 13.8 above our revenue limit, but could be a combination of aid and tax levy.
Not necessarily just tax levy.
Right. Right. So those calculations that showed the tax impact were the estimate on the levy portion of that. Yeah.
Just one other question. So at least reading this and based on your comments, it seems the first year, the 6 million is sort of the reset, and then
Yeah.
the other ones are
Just-
inflation
exactly.
costs. So I guess just trying to figure out, and if your current expenses are about 50 million a year, what do you see in a few years that is going to be another 10 million
Yeah.
or 13 million in just projecting?
Yeah. So the projected increase would be inflationary increases, as well as we are increasing enrollment. So as the enrollment continues to increase, that will mean needing to hire more staff, perhaps more transportation costs. So it's a little bit higher than inflationary increase, taking into account those projections as well.
And the other impact is, and you can look at this a couple different ways, but our current revenue limit to exceed goes away. So, I mean, you said the second year or the 3rd year is the 13, but if you back off the 3.7 for that year, it's really more like 10 or 9 something.
Yeah.
So that's the true impact of the increases. We have to make that up the 3rd year. And as Dan pointed out, the first year is big because we have about over 3 million of COVID going away, plus we've used fund balance the last couple of years. And then, so we have a structural deficit, and then the inflationary on top of that.
Yeah, thanks for that correction. So as you mentioned, the dark blue on the bottom is the 3.7 we currently have the authority. That goes away there. So over the current amount, it's actually 10.1 more. Yeah.
I guess my question is based on, I don't know if you have this information tonight, but the 7 other school districts that passed the referendum, where does Monona Grove rank in the request to this time based on what has been asked? And has other school districts had success with that, or where are we at competing with them?
Yeah, great question. So the other districts in Dane County, some are a little, quite a bit larger than us, some Prairie, Middleton. The couple that were similar size to us, Oregon, Wanakee, I would say that the dollar amounts, Oregon's probably the best example. Their dollar amounts were very similar to ours.
And they phased theirs into.
Yeah.
Regardless of what the other districts in Dane County have done, that still leaves, what, 400 districts or something like that haven't increased their budgets for the forthcoming year, or don't have a referendum for the forthcoming.
So there are 421 school districts in Wisconsin. I don't know the exact number. There are a number throughout the state as well. So I have the exact numbers for Dane County. But there are a number throughout the state that are also in referendum over these last 2 years. So. One other number I am aware of, and this goes back more historically. So since revenue limits, over 300 districts out of the 400 in Wisconsin have done an operational referendum of some sort. But that's spread out over that, longer period of time. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for coming this evening. I will stick around if anyone has any additional conversation you'd like to have before you leave as well. So. And again, for those of you that are watching, the information, encourage you to go to the website. Lots of information in addition to what we provided tonight on our FAQs. So thank you very much.